I refused to babysit my brother's children. Then they arrived alone with a note and an open police case. He told me it was just for a couple hours. Then a taxi dropped them off like a forgotten delivery, and I turned down babysitting my brother's kids, and then they showed up anyway, dropped off alone with a note and the beginning of a police-level mess. My name's Mike, I'm 28, and about 3 days ago I learned exactly how seriously my brother takes the word no, which is to say not seriously at all, because a taxi rolled up outside my apartment and unloaded 3 bewildered kids, a couple of backpacks, a diaper bag, and a driver who stared at me like, "Buddy, please tell me this circus belongs to you." It all kicked off that morning when my brother, Brian, called me using that soft, panic tone parents use when they're trying to negotiate with fate. "Mike, pal, hear me out. I really need a massive favor. Just for a few hours, can you watch the kids?" For context, I adore my nieces and nephew. They're adorable, messy, noisy, and they think I'm a magician because I once managed to open a Capri Sun without soaking the furniture. I love them, but I also value the calm, kid-free balance of my tiny one-bedroom place. And on top of that, I was working from home that day, stacked with Zoom meetings with real clients, the kind who pay my bills and do not appreciate random screaming in the background. So I told him, calmly but clearly, "No, Brian, I can't do it today." He let out this heavy sigh like I'd personally doomed his entire family legacy. "Come on, man, I'm desperate." Still no. He muttered something bitter about how family used to mean something and then hung up. I honestly thought that was the end of it, which in hindsight was wildly optimistic. About 3 hours later, I'm pouring coffee before my next call when the buzzer goes off, and when I answer the intercom, some unfamiliar guy says, "Taxi for Mike? I've got kids here." Kids, as in more than one. I open the front door just in time to see 3 small humans spill out of the back seat while the driver starts unloading bags like he's evacuating people from a disaster zone. My nephew, the youngest, waddles toward me clutching a juice box upside down, juice already dripping. My oldest niece looks up at me and says, "Daddy said you'd take care of us today because you were being dramatic." Dramatic. Before I could even fully process that, the driver shoved a receipt into my hand, said already paid, "Good luck," and peeled out like the building was haunted. I stood there while 3 little faces stared up at me, juice seeping through fingers, backpacks hanging open, one sock already missing from someone, and it suddenly hit me hard. If Brian put them in a taxi, who exactly was supposed to be supervising them? I ushered everyone inside while calling Brian over and over, straight to voicemail, every time. That's when my middle niece tugged on my sleeve and said, "Uncle Mike?" Daddy told the driver to hurry because he was going to miss his flight. His flight. My brother had actually dumped his kids on me and gone to the airport, and somehow that wasn't even the worst part. When I checked the diaper bag, I found a note, scribbled fast, clearly rushed, and completely unhinged, starting with the words, "Don't panic." But, which is how every disaster movie opens, how every bad parenting choice begins, and how Brian once explained why his college kitchen was on fire. I took a breath and kept reading. He wrote that he had to catch this flight or he'd lose the job, figured I'd understand, and that I just needed to watch them for the weekend. Only the weekend, and we'd talk when he got back. Thanks, bro. You're the best. Weekend. Not a few hours, not a day, but multiple days, alone with 3 kids who were now looking at me like I was the activities coordinator on a sinking cruise ship. To make it worse, the note was stuffed into a half-empty diaper bag with no spare diapers, no snacks, no routine, no instructions, nothing but vibes and impending chaos. My oldest niece, Lily, flopped onto my couch like she'd checked into a resort and said, "Daddy said you'd be fun. Do you have slime?" No, what I had was a 2 p.m. Zoom meeting and an overwhelming urge to strangle my brother. But I couldn't take it out on them because none of this was their fault. This was pure Brian behavior. Create a disaster, label it family bonding, and vanish. I tried to sit them down and make some kind of plan, but instead the toddler climbed into my lap and dumped milk all over my shirt. The middle one burst into tears because milk was on my shirt, and Lily announced she was bored, and it wasn't even noon yet. I grabbed my phone again, called, texted, called, nothing. I tried his wife next, only to remember she was at a yoga retreat with limited service, and all I got back was an automated message that said, "Namaste." I'm unplugged for the next 72 hours. Of course she was. I inhaled, put on my best polite voice, and called Brian's workplace, thinking maybe he was lying about everything and I could catch him before he vanished. The receptionist answered, "This is Karen," and when I asked for Brian, her voice shifted instantly from professional to concerned. "Oh," she said, "he doesn't work here anymore." I froze and asked what she meant, and she explained he quit that morning. Quit that morning, headed to an airport, abandoned his kids, lied straight to my face, and now his phone was going straight to voicemail like he'd thrown it into the sea. I thanked her, hung up, and stared into space for a full 10 seconds before my nephew tugged my leg and said, "Uncle Mike, I'm hungry," which honestly felt inevitable. I made PB&J sandwiches because that was the only thing I had enough of to feed 3 kids, and while they ate, I stood there trying to understand why my brother would detonate his own life and pull me into the blast. That's when Lily casually said something that made my stomach drop. "Daddy said we're getting a new house, a really big one, but we're not allowed to know where yet." A new house, a secret location, a disappearing act, and suddenly the rushed handwriting in the note made terrifying sense, because Brian wasn't just dodging responsibility, he was running from something, and somehow I was part of the cover story. I crouched in front of Lily and asked what she meant by a new house, and she shrugged, kicking her feet, saying Daddy told them not to tell Mommy because it was a surprise, not to tell me because I'd freak out, and definitely not Grandma, because she'd ruin everything. That was a parade of red flags with a marching band. I asked when he told her this, and she said last night while he was packing that he called it a big adventure and said they'd all go together. But this morning plans changed, and they were coming to me first. My gut twisted, because he wasn't just hiding, he was dragging these kids into it, except now he'd abandoned them on my doorstep like overnight shipping. I stepped into the hallway and tried calling again. Voicemail. Texted him to call me now, demanded to know where he was, if he was at the airport, if the kids were safe, and what the hell was happening, and still nothing. While behind me the chaos ramped up as the toddler discovered the button panel on my dishwasher. The middle kid had uncovered the forbidden thrill of bouncing on my bed like it was a trampoline, while Lily wanted to know if I had Wi-Fi so she could watch videos, because clearly that was the missing piece to this disaster. I stopped, inhaled deeply, the long intentional breath therapists swear by, and it did absolutely nothing to calm me. Then my phone rang, and it wasn't Brian, it was an unfamiliar number, so I answered instantly and blurted out, "Brian?" Instead, a man said, "Is this Mike Bennett?" I said yes, and he replied, "This is Officer Ramirez with Airport Police," and my stomach dropped straight through the floor. I asked if my brother was okay, if something happened, if the kids were, and he cut in to say my brother was not there, but my number was listed as an emergency contact on a missing person report filed about 20 minutes earlier. Missing? I repeated, lightheaded. Missing who? Papers shuffled on his end, and he said 3 minors. Last seen with their father around 9:10 a.m. Witnesses stating the father entered the airport, exited through a side door, and fled the area after leaving the children in the back seat of a taxi. I braced myself against the wall and told him the kids were with me, that Brian had sent them to my apartment. "That's good news," Ramirez said evenly, but he added that they needed to speak with me immediately about my brother's recent actions and possible location. I told him I didn't know where Brian was, that he claimed he had a flight, which was obviously a lie, and the officer said they had reason to believe my brother might be attempting to avoid a legal situation. A chill ran up my spine, and I asked what kind of situation, and he said they'd explain when they arrived, that a unit was already en route to verify the children's safety and take my statement. I looked back into my apartment where the toddler was mashing buttons on my dishwasher. The middle kid had wrapped himself in my blanket like a superhero cape, and Lily was sipping juice like she'd booked a weekend spa package, and my quiet Saturday officially flatlined. I told the officer there was something else, that Brian had left a note talking about running off to a new house, that I thought he was disappearing, and after a pause Ramirez told me not to leave, not to contact my brother again, and that officers were on the way. Then the call ended. I slid my phone away, leaned into the wall, and muttered, "Brian, what the hell did you do?" Because instead of waiting on test results or bad news, I was now waiting on police officers and the very real possibility that my brother had done something monumentally stupid. Inside, the kids were unfazed. The the toddler now clanging measuring spoons together like sacred artifacts, the middle one sticking decals all over my cat, who looked deeply offended yet accepting of his fate, and Lily watching me with the focused seriousness of a tiny attorney preparing cross-examination. "Uncle Mike," she asked slowly, "are we in trouble?" I froze, because I didn't want them scared. They didn't deserve that. This wasn't their mess. It was Brian's storm, and they were just stuck in the rain. I knelt in front of her and promised she wasn't in trouble, that they were safe with me, and she nodded and went back to her juice, though her eyes lingered like she wasn't fully convinced. I checked the window every 30 seconds until 2 police cruisers finally pulled up, and I opened the door before they even knocked. Officer Ramirez was tall and calm, wearing the expression of someone who'd seen enough chaos to rank this one as bad, but not catastrophic, and he confirmed my name before stepping inside. He explained they'd received a report that 3 minors were abandoned at the airport by their father, and I clarified that technically they were ditched at a taxi stand and delivered to my door like the worst possible food delivery, which didn't earn a smile. His partner began gently talking to the kids, checking on them and handing out stickers, which thrilled the toddler instantly, and Ramirez pulled out his notebook and asked if I had any idea where my brother might be. I told him no, that Brian's phone was dead. He quit his job that morning, told the kids about a new house, left a note about a flight and a job he didn't actually have, then vanished. He wrote everything down and asked if Brian had money problems, which made me laugh without humor because that was basically his personality. Then he asked about legal trouble, and that stopped me cold. I thought about unpaid bills, sketchy side hustles, loud arguments, and that one time he sold refurbished laptops that absolutely did not come from a legitimate source, and I told the officer I wouldn't rule anything out, but Brian hadn't said a word to me. Ramirez nodded like that fit neatly into a box and quietly told me they believed my brother might be tied to a fraud investigation involving his former employer. Fraud? I repeated, stunned. My brother who once asked me how to spell receipt, and Ramirez said potentially criminal, enough to trigger panic. My head felt like it was overheating as I asked if he really ran and abandoned his kids, and Ramirez said some people crack under pressure and make reckless choices. But the important thing was that the kids were safe. I watched as the toddler proudly showed off a sticker on his forehead. The middle kid asked if police cars had bathrooms, and Lily sat quietly gripping the couch cushion. And then Ramirez told me that until Brian was located, the children couldn't be returned to either parent. I asked what that meant, and he said for now they stayed with me, that temporarily I was their responsible adult, and my stomach sank as the 3 kids looked at me, and my normal weekend officially transformed into emergency guardianship, and Brian's disappearance stopped being just a family problem and became something much bigger. It felt like a legal tornado spinning straight toward me. And Officer Ramirez must have seen the fear building in my face because he put a steady hand on my shoulder, the way doctors do right before they say something gently awful. "This is temporary," he told me, "just long enough to make sure the kids are safe while we find your brother." Temporary, sure, because so is lava once it starts moving, and the second the cops pulled away, reality slammed into me full force. I was suddenly the cook, the referee, the emotional support animal, the babysitter, and the uncle who now had to Google things like how much milk is too much milk for a toddler before science intervenes. The kids just stared at me, waiting for direction, or food first and direction later. So I clapped my hands and said, "Okay, we're going to try for a calm afternoon," which lasted exactly 10 seconds before the toddler screamed because he wanted the blue cup instead of the red one. The middle kid announced she was allergic to boredom, and Lily sat quietly watching me with a look that said, "You're trying, Uncle Mike." But this is alarming. I tried calling Brian again, straight to voicemail, tried texting him, nothing, then tried calling Claire, only to remember she was still spiritually unplugging somewhere and definitely not answering. So I did what any grown man trapped with kids in a crisis would do and turned on a movie, opened my laptop, and attempted a rescheduled work meeting on mute. The toddler climbed onto my back mid-zoom. The middle kid dumped pretzels onto my carpet, and Lily, bless her, sat beside me like a tiny security guard whispering that it was okay, and that people at my job probably had kids too. Halfway through the meeting, my phone buzzed with another unknown number, so I excused myself, ducked into the hallway, and answered with a cautious hello, only to be met by a woman's voice that was sharp, frantic, furious, and exhausted all at once, asking where her children were. It was Claire, and I breathed her name out loud and asked if she wasn't at yoga, and she snapped back that she'd left because the retreat made them turn in their phones, and when she got hers back, she had 37 missed calls from the police. I leaned against the wall and told her the kids were safe and with me, and she demanded why. So I told her everything. The taxi, the note, the cops, the fraud investigation, Brian vanishing into thin air, and when I finished she let out a long breath like someone trying not to scream into the void and said she knew he was hiding something, that he promised he was fixing it. I softened my voice and asked what he was running from, and after a long silence she told me he drained their savings, all of it, every account, and that last night he told her to pack because they were starting over, and she thought he meant a trip or a job move, not this. I shut my eyes because of course my brother didn't just panic, he stole their money, quit his job, dumped his kids, and disappeared. So I told her the police were looking for him and might need to talk to her, and she whispered that she knew and said she was driving to my place. I hesitated and told her the kids legally had to stay with me for now, and she said that was fine, just please keep them safe. Then she hung up, leaving me staring at the wall with my heart racing and my brain screaming, because Brian hadn't just messed up, he blew up his entire life and sprayed the shrapnel all over me, Claire, and 3 kids who deserved none of this. There was a soft knock at the door and Lily called out that someone was there, and when I opened it, Claire stood in front of me with red eyes, shaking hands, and a look that told me the next day was going to be pure chaos. I'd never seen her without that calm yoga mom vibe, the herbal tea, no yelling energy, and this version of her was raw, wrecked, furious, and terrified all at once. She stepped inside and dropped to her knees as the kids ran to her, wrapping them up tight like she needed to physically prove they were real, whispering thank God and oh my sweet babies into their hair while the toddler patted her cheek and asked if mommy was sad, making her laugh and cry at the same time while she insisted everything was fine, even though it very clearly wasn't. Once the kids were distracted with snacks, she pulled me into the kitchen, gripping the counter because her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and told me she needed every detail. So I walked her through it all again. The taxi, the note, the cops, the fraud, the empty accounts, the fake flight, and her face cycled through shock, anger, grief, and rage all at once before she covered her eyes and said she thought Brian had been lying for months, maybe longer. I asked about what, and she dropped her hands and looked straight at me and said he told her he was investing their savings into a sure thing, some business that would change their lives, and she assumed it was just another one of his half-baked side hustles until he told her last week that someone threatened him. I leaned in and asked how much money, and she swallowed and said everything they had and possibly more, and I muttered Jesus under my breath and asked quietly if that meant he ran from debt collectors or the law, and she nodded and said he told her he had a plan, that they'd leave before things got bad, and she thought he meant moving in with family, not vanishing and abandoning his own kids. I felt sick, but I could tell there was more, something she was holding back, so I asked gently if there was anything else, and after a shaky breath she told me he asked if she had passports ready for the kids because they might need to get out fast, and she said she thought he was just stressed, thought he was being dramatic, and her voice cracked as she realized how wrong she'd been. I never even considered that possibility, and Claire covered her mouth like the thought had physically hit her, because suddenly it all made horrible sense. He hadn't just planned to disappear, he'd planned to leave the country with the kids, which explained the packing, the talk about a new house, and the panic that made him dump them instead. He must have realized there was no way he'd get 3 kids through TSA or customs without alarms going off, so he chose what he thought was the safer option and vanished alone. A cold chill slid down my spine as I whispered that he was going to take them and run, and Claire nodded quietly, saying she thought so too. We stood there in thick, awful silence, letting that sink in, when the front door buzzer went off again, making Claire stiffen as she asked if it was the police. I checked the door monitor and felt my stomach drop, because it wasn't cops, or a neighbor, or a delivery guy, but a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, shaved head, leather jacket, arms crossed, staring straight into the camera, and when he realized I was watching, he leaned in and smiled, not friendly, more like he knew exactly who I was. At the same moment my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that said, "Tell Brian I'm done waiting," and Claire went pale, and whispered that the man was one of the people Brian owed money to. That's when everything snapped into focus, because Brian wasn't just hiding from police, he was hiding from people who were now standing outside my building, and they thought he was here. I stepped back from the monitor so fast I nearly tripped over the toddler, who'd wandered up holding a Cheerio like it was evidence in court, while Claire grabbed my arm and said that was the guy Brian warned might show up if things got messy, which felt like the understatement of the century. I asked if he knew her address, and she whispered no, that Brian told him they were staying with family, but never said which family, which meant congratulations, I was now the mystery family, worst prize imaginable. The buzzer sounded again, longer and angrier, followed by another text from a different unknown number that said, "Open the door, we need to talk," and that plural made my skin crawl. When I checked the monitor again, there were now two men, leather jacket guy and his friend, a brick-shaped guy with a scar across his face that looked like it had been sketched by a rushed comic book artist. Claire backed toward the kids asking what we were supposed to do, and I forced myself to breathe and think, because I had 3 kids in my living room, a terrified mom, and 2 very unfriendly debt collectors outside. And while I wasn't a fighter or a hero, and definitely not built for this, I wasn't about to let them inside either. I called Officer Ramirez, who answered immediately, and I told him in a low voice that the men my brother owed money to were outside my building. And when he asked if they were inside, and I said no, he ordered me not to engage, to lock the door, move everyone away from the windows, and said units were already on the way. I asked how fast that was. He said fast, and hung up just as the buzzer went off again, harder this time. I stepped in front of the door so the kids couldn't see and pressed the intercom, telling them Brian wasn't here, and leather jacket guy leaned closer to the camera and said then I was going to tell them where he was. I told him I didn't know, and he smirked and said my brother owed a lot of money and someone in that apartment knew something. So I told him to leave and said the police were already coming. After a brief silence, the scarred guy said they'd be back and next time they wouldn't knock. Then they turned and walked away. Claire rushed to lock the door, added the chain, the deadbolt, and shoved a chair under the handle like we were bracing for zombies, while I bent forward gripping my knees trying not to pass out as she whispered that this was insane and she couldn't believe Brian dragged us into this. A couple minutes later sirens echoed, flashing lights followed, and soon officers were at my door confirming the men were gone for now. Ramirez looked serious when he told me this was no longer just about a missing person, that my brother was involved with very dangerous people, and when I asked what we were supposed to do, he explained a patrol would stay nearby, but we couldn't leave with the kids until Brian was found or a court decided otherwise. So now we were basically trapped in my own apartment. When the police finally left, the adrenaline drained out of me, and I sat down hard, seeing the kids huddled on my bed with Claire, who was crying quietly into her hands, until Lily noticed me, climbed down, and walked over with the careful confidence of someone way too young to have it. She asked in a small voice if we were staying here forever, and my throat tightened as I knelt and told her no, just until things got sorted out. And when she asked if her dad was in trouble, I didn't lie and said yes, he was. She nodded like she already knew, then leaned in and hugged me, small and shaking. And that was the moment it hit me that I wasn't babysitting anymore. I was the only stable adult these kids had left, and Brian's disappearance wasn't the end of the chaos. It was the start, with a police car idling outside like a nervous guard dog, and me running on about 40 minutes of broken sleep. The kids ended up sleeping in my bed. Claire crashed on the couch, and I took the floor between them like the world's worst-paid night watchman, and at exactly 6:12 a.m. The toddler woke up by planting both feet square on my chest and declaring he wanted pancakes, which is a very effective way to confirm you are, in fact, alive. I made pancakes, badly, while Claire helped in a fog, still exhausted, still jittery like her nervous system hadn't accepted that the night was technically over. We fed the kids, turned on cartoons, and made a weak attempt to pretend things were normal, which failed almost immediately. Around 8 there was a knock at the door, gentle and familiar, and when I checked the monitor and saw Officer Ramirez, I actually felt relief wash over me as I let him in. He had the same calm, steady presence, but this time his face carried extra weight, and when he said my name and Claire's and told us there were developments, Claire straightened so fast she nearly spilled her coffee and asked if they'd found Brian. Ramirez hesitated and said not yet, but they had found his car, abandoned behind a strip mall a few towns over, unlocked with the keys missing, and I felt Claire wobble beside me as Ramirez steadied her and carefully added that it didn't necessarily mean something bad had happened, that the car could have been left intentionally or by someone else. Claire whispered that someone else could have done it, and Ramirez didn't contradict her, but before panic could take over, he told us they'd searched the car and found something important, then handed me an evidence bag with a folded sheet inside. It was a printed airline confirmation, one adult, one-way ticket to Belize, departure yesterday morning, and while it wasn't in Brian's name, the date of birth matched his exactly. I said quietly that he really planned to run, and Ramirez agreed but pointed out the timestamp, explaining the check-in was never completed and the ticket was never used, which hit me hard because it meant he tried to flee and either couldn't or was stopped. I asked if Brian was in danger, and Ramirez's jaw tightened as he said they were treating it as both a missing person case and a criminal investigation and coordinating across departments, which felt like a careful way of saying yes, very possibly. He told us again that until Brian was located, the safest place for the kids was with me under police supervision and not to open the door for anyone else, and I nodded without really feeling my body. After he left, Claire collapsed onto the couch and buried her face in her hands, saying she couldn't believe this, that Brian wasn't supposed to be this kind of person. He was supposed to be dumb and irresponsible, not dangerous. And I sat beside her and told her none of this was her fault. She laughed bitterly and said she married him, trusted him, let him near their savings, and that felt like fault. But I told her firmly that what she was feeling was betrayal, not blame, and she looked at me with glassy, exhausted eyes and whispered that I'd been incredible and she didn't know what she would have done without me. I had no idea how to hold that kind of praise and shrugged it off, saying I was just doing what anyone would do. But she shook her head and said no, I was doing what Brian should have done, and that one landed hard. We sat quietly until the kids barreled over demanding snacks, attention, and reassurance we didn't quite know how to give yet, and by noon the apartment felt like a pressure cooker, Claire pacing, the kids drawing on printer paper, and me staring at the Belize ticket like it might explain itself if I stared long enough. Then Lily climbed into the chair next to me and set a crayon drawing on the table, a messy picture of 4 stick-figure kids, 1 stick-figure woman, and 1 stick-figure man all holding hands, and when I asked if it was her family, she nodded and pointed out her mom, herself, and her siblings, then pointed to the man and said that was Daddy. My throat tightened as I asked who the taller figure next to her was, and she said simply that it was me, because Daddy was gone and I was the grown-up now, and that truth settled over me with a strange weight that felt heavy but purposeful. I folded the picture carefully and thanked her, and when she leaned her head against my arm and asked if her dad would come back, I looked at her face and chose honesty, telling her I didn't know, but that no matter what she'd be safe and not alone, and she nodded and wandered back to Claire. I was still staring at the picture when my phone buzzed with an unknown number and a message that said, "We found him," followed by, "You need to come in," and I knew instantly this wasn't close to over. I called right away, and Ramirez answered, and when I asked if Brian was alive there was a pause before he said yes, but that I needed to hear the rest in person, so I grabbed my jacket, told Claire I had to go to the station, and while her face went pale she nodded and told me to come back. At the station, Ramirez met me with paperwork and eyes that looked years older than the day before and told me Brian had been found outside a motel near the state line, disoriented and injured from exhaustion and dehydration, not a fight, but that he hadn't been alone. My heart slammed as I asked who he was with, and Ramirez said it was a woman, someone Brian had been hiding, and that she told them everything, the fraud, the debt, the escape plan, including taking the kids out of the country. My chest tightened as Ramirez added that Brian claimed he didn't want to burden the kids with the fallout. But the truth was he was running from them too, and when I asked what happened next, Ramirez said Brian was in custody, and that for now, I was still the safest place for the kids. I leaned back in the chair, lightheaded, realizing that without ever volunteering for it I'd somehow become the only stable thing left in the wreckage, and for the kids' sake I knew I had to stay upright. Walking out of the station felt like stepping out of a storm shelter after the tornado had already torn the roof off, where you're safe for the moment, but nothing looks the way you remember it. When I got back to my apartment, all 3 kids were practically fused to Claire, clustered around her like little planets afraid to lose orbit, And when she saw my expression, she slowly stood, bracing herself before whispering, "Well?" I dropped down to one knee so the kids wouldn't see the worst of it and told her they found Brian, that he was alive, not okay, and now in custody. And she let out a shaky breath that sounded like grief, anger, and relief all tangled together, then covered her mouth, nodded, and sank onto the couch arm. Lily stepped forward and asked me in that small, hopeful voice if Daddy was coming home. And I looked at her and felt something steady and clear settle in me as I told her gently that not for a while, but she was safe and staying with us until everything was sorted out, and that I promised. She nodded slowly and took my hand like she was anchoring herself to the promise. The days that followed blurred into paperwork, interviews, visits from child services, police check-ins, and lawyers calling Claire nonstop. But through all of it, the kids stayed close and strangely calmer, like the waiting and not knowing had been the scariest part. One night after they'd fallen asleep in another tangled pile on my bed, Claire sat across from me at the kitchen table rubbing her eyes and quietly said I saved them. And I shook my head and told her no, I just opened the door, but she murmured that sometimes that's what saving looks like, and maybe she was right. I didn't go looking for this responsibility, didn't ask to become the emergency adult in my brother's implosion. But somewhere in the chaos something became painfully clear to me. Family isn't the person who drags you into the dark, it's the one who turns on the light. And right now for these kids and for Claire, that light was me. Not forever, not as a replacement, just until things stopped falling apart. And as I watched those three small bodies breathing together in sleep, one quiet thought settled deep inside me, steady and unexpected. Maybe I can do this, and maybe I already am.